Welcome to today's Environment and Energy Leader webinar sponsored by Montrose Environmental Group, an environmental services company. My name is Jessica Hunt, and on behalf of the entire team at ENE Leader, I welcome you to Everyone Wins, How Net Environmental Benefit Analysis Comparative Assessment Framework can create the best offshore infrastructure decommissioning solution. During this webinar, you will have the opportunity to hear from 3 subject matter experts as they explore the decision-making framework that effectively incorporates quantified ecosystem service values associated with offshore energy infrastructure. Questions specific to the presentation, as well as any technical issues, may be submitted through the Q&A widget, which is already open on your screen. We just ask that before sending questions regarding video and sound, you check your system and follow the steps listed in the help widget at the bottom of your console. Please feel free to communicate with other participants during today's event using the attendee chat widget. Please let us know where you are joining from and why you decided to jump on with us today. And again, please direct all questions to presenters in the Q&A widget. Additionally, take notice of the 2 call to action buttons, as well as resources provided by ENE Leader and Montrose. As well, all attendees will be receiving a certificate of attendance for meeting specific viewing criteria. And now, I know everyone is here to listen to our 3 experts and not me, so I am extremely pleased to welcome all from Montrose, Joe Nicolette, Nicholas Nelson, and Dr. Mark Rockel. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to them, and I will be back at the end to wrap everything up.
Thanks, Jessica, and really appreciate everybody taking the time to join this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our co-presenters. Myself, I head up the Ecosystem Service Economics Group for Montrose Environmental Group. And then Mark Rockel is a PhD resource economist, and Nick Nelson is a scientist that also works with our group. And on behalf of Montrose, we appreciate the opportunity to present some of the advances that we've made in environmental decision making, especially as it relates to offshore decommissioning of subsea structures. The work is based on our team's worldwide experience on the use of natural resource economics approaches that are used to enhance the decision-making process. Today, we're going to be discussing a net environmental benefit analysis-based comparative assessment framework, also known as a NEBA-CA, for decommissioning option decision-making. The framework provides a win-win scenario for regulators, the industry, the public, and importantly, the environment. The overall goal of the approach is to maximize ecosystem service benefits, both ecological and social, to the public while managing site risks. That is, we help find that optimum balance between the risks and benefits in competing options. The NEBA-CA concept first came out and was first published, not first published, but presented at the Offshore Oil Platform Decommissioning Forum in January of 2020. We were invited to present this by the state of California, as it incorporated both state and federal agencies, and really as a way to help educate the public, regulators, and industry, as well as other stakeholders about the decommissioning process. In doing so, we developed a video that provides an overview of decommissioning, the issues that are faced in the decision-making process, and we introduced the NEBA-CA approach. And the video was presented at the Aquarium of the Pacific as part of this option. One of the things I also wanted to bring up is if you did not have a chance to look at the video, you'll be able to check that out later on. We'll be providing a link where you're going to be able to access a variety of the different types of publications that we'll talk about during this presentation. The agenda for the call is really, or for the webinar, is to talk about NEBA-CA. What is it? Then we're going to talk about the science behind it. How did it evolve? And then we've worked in this area for over 10 years in applying these net environmental benefit analysis process to offshore decommissioning over a significant amount of time, with a series of publications related to a framework for how do we look at this, looking at plastics degradation, long-term liability management, and also there's a podcast that we developed as well that talks about the overall process and some of our experience in that area. What we're going to talk about now is I'm going to give you an introduction to NEBA-CA related to offshore decommissioning. And in this regard, the recent data, what's happened is that recent data has indicated that offshore oil and gas structures have been in the oceans for decades and have accumulated significant ecological and social value. You've had accumulation of benthic organisms, fish and reptiles, as well as attraction by marine mammals. Marine mammals have been noted to use these areas as feeding stations, and as evident, the sea turtle here is also feeding along this subsea structure as well. One of the things as well to consider is these structures degrade over a very long time. So there's a lot of value and time frames associated with how these will be in place for hundreds to potentially 1,000 years. So, and as well as they require exclusion zones that protect the asset from navigation, unauthorized navigation, help protect health and safety of the public, as well as prevent trawling from occurring too close to the equipment as well. These areas have provided value to the public for a long period of time. The precautionary principle itself states that the precautionary principle of risk management implies that if an action or policy has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or the environment, in the absence of scientific consensus that the action or policy is not harmful, the burden of proof that it's not harmful falls on those taking the action. Thus, the decision makers on what to do with the subsea structure is important. And that's one of the things that the precautionary principle focuses on. And the precautionary principle encourages then policies that protect human health and the environment in the face of uncertain risks. It's meant to ensure the societal good is represented. The question becomes, do we have consensus that removal of these structures provides greater benefit than managing them in part or in whole in the environment? When you look at this problem that's being faced right now, there's 6,000 oil and gas platforms globally, with hundreds to be decommissioned every year over the next decade. They have been documented to have valuable ecosystems, and many of the regulations that were developed a while back really say full removal is the preferred option, to go back to a clean seabed. However, these regulations precede some of the science that's really come out recently. So the question becomes, does the clean seabed actually provide greater incremental value compared to the ecosystem supported by the hard structure? Additionally, repeated trawling in the North Sea, which is trawled approximately 6% of its area, it has impacted the seafloor. So a clean seabed baseline does not exist because trawling occurs every several years, so the system really can't get back to that baseline level. What we're focusing on now and talking about today, and this is a paper we just published in the Frontiers in Marine Science, and it includes a North Sea case study. The paper is a framework for conducting net environmental benefit analysis-based comparative assessment of decommissioning options for the subsea structure. And this framework is based on our worldwide experience. The approach was developed to help strengthen the comparative assessment process and enhance that process, and how that process is applied to offshore decommissioning decision making. When we talk about enhancing and strengthening the comparative assessment process, or CA, the current CA processes have some disadvantages. One of the things we found through this experience and work we've done in the North Sea, Australia, Gulf of Thailand, in California, Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Australia, the regulators are looking for more consistency and transparency in the decision making, because without that, it's hard for them to vary or veer away from really what they consider the base case of doing a full removal. So when we look at the comparative assessment processes that have been done to date, and you look at those, some of those have some issues in terms of some disadvantages, in the guidance on how you implement them is vague. The rigor in developing the values are vague. For example, in the graph you see to the right, you can have multiple options that are green, some are red, some are yellow with different coatings. So it really doesn't help you to narrow down on a specific alternative, and it gives you there's a potential that differences between these options could be obscured. So there's potential for stakeholder bias depending on who's at the table in making these decisions. And one of the things too that this process does not fully take advantage of is understanding the multi-generational benefits provided by the subsea structure. CAs tend to focus on risks, whereas we like to include a good example of the benefits associated with a risk, so you can do a comparison of those two. And again, in the graphics and the presentation of results, that's another area where we thought that it would be good to develop a process and approach whereby the results of this study can be presented in a way that's consistent for the regulators, and that provides them the consistency and the transparency they're looking for. The framework that's presented in the paper that was just presented really encompasses 3 different types of information. The first is, your first step is your analysis planning, which is really a big step in how you're going to conduct your analysis of options. Once the analysis plan is done, then you go through and you actually conduct the analysis and you develop the graphics and what does this initial data say. Then, after you have that initial analysis, then there's a risk management decision-making process that comes into account, where it allows the stakeholders to look at the data after looking at what the initial science says, and either weight or rank certain variables at this point in time, or make a case as to why one option may be better than another. One of the important notes here, as you can see, is that stakeholder management occurs throughout the process. So it should occur often through the process. This framework is an adaptation of the original Net Environmental Benefit Analysis Framework published in 2004. And I co-authored that publication with the United States Environmental Protection Agency and Oak Ridge National Laboratory, risk assessors from those groups. And that framework is recognized in the United States by US EPA, US EPA Science Advisory Board, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, as well as the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, plus others. So this is an approach that I've focused on in my career for over 30 years. The goal of the approach, and I mentioned this earlier, is we want to maximize ecosystem service benefits to the public while managing site risks. And within this process, NEBA-CA is a holistic approach. even though it says net environmental benefit analysis, it's not just environmental factors that are included in the analysis. It's societal factors, financial factors, technical factors. We look at health and safety. And again, one of the key things that we add into the mix here is understanding what are the benefits provided and what are the benefits provided over time. So the time analysis in this framework is very important. So we look at those benefits over time. We do not do any upfront ranking or weighting. We don't want to include that. We want to be able to look at that upfront and say, here's what the data says, so that the stakeholders can look at the information and come up with a decision or reason as to why or why not a certain option was made. You can always rank or weight something later in the process, but that would really come towards the end when you're looking at your threshold values. The other thing too is we want to provide transparency to stakeholders on the inputs into the comparative assessment. So the process provides a lot of quantitation for a variety of different types of metrics within that process. We talk about the benefits of subsea structure. It supports diverse and thriving ecosystems, fish production and refuge and protection of fish species from trawling, given that you have an exclusion zone. Marine mammals use these as feeding grounds. Special species like cold water coral in the North Sea has been shown to proliferate on a variety of the different platforms there. And that's a species that was in decline in the North Sea. So there is some value there. There's also been shown that there's biological interconnectivity between platforms or other subsea structures within the ocean. And again, because of the ability to protect fish stocks, it does provide some additional value in that regard. There's also social and human use values. You might be able to dive on a piece of property or around an asset and do photography or use it for education. There's also passive use values. It might, value that the protection of a threatened endangered species and the fact that it is there and it's going to be there for centuries to come. So it's really a bequest value that it's going to be for you, be there for yourself, your kids, and into the future. So there are those values that we look at. Also, and when we look at this, there's not just an area of the still structure that is really creating habitat. The shells from the upper portion of some of the different assets fall to the ground and actually create hard structure on the sea floor. And that sea floor in and of itself creates an additional habitat aside from just what's attached to the still. And that area can be anywhere from 4 to 15 times the size of a platform itself. And it depends on obviously the conditions that you're looking at in that regard. And with the protection zone, the exclusion zone, all these areas have basically functioned as de facto marine protected areas because it's not allowed trawling in there. So it's been able to protect the fish stocks that are in here. And as well, fish stocks have been shown to actually reproduce within these areas. They don't just aggregate fish, they also act as areas of secondary fish production. Just as an example, this is a study that was conducted in 2014, and the study just shows secondary fish production on offshore platforms at a variety of places across the world. If we focus on California and look at soft bottom habitat, which if you remove the hard structure that's there, you end up reverting back to this soft bottom habitat. And that shows you what the fish production is of that habitat in California. If we look at deep rocky reefs in California, if we look at estuaries in California, and we look at artificial rocky reefs in California, you can see they start to generate significantly more value. This study did identify that the most production of any of the natural reefs in the world are under and associated with these oil platforms in the order of anywhere from 18 to 150 times the value or secondary fish production that you see in soft bottom habitat. when we talk about ecosystem services and the incorporation of these into the framework, we have a habitat or an ecosystem in the ocean. And that ecological habitat, because of its presence, also provides human use services. You could fish, you could commercial fish, recreationally fish. It provides a variety of different human use services. One of the things to keep in mind is if you do not have the habitat, you do not have the human use services. So actions that affect the habitat affect the human use services. So that's very important to understand that relationship between the habitat and the social values that arise from the presence of that habitat. In general, and this is a conceptual graphic, just shows that a habitat provides value over time. And we know that it fluctuates potentially by season and by year, but in general provides a certain value over time. When we look at an action that affects the environment, you get a loss of that value, and that depending on the magnitude of that impact, you get a loss of that value over time. So there is a potential loss in looking at the ecosystem services provided over time. We can quantify what that loss is. Additionally, if there's an action that enhances the environment and provides a benefit above the current baseline, then you can calculate as well, what is the benefit of a certain action? In this case, as an example, when we look at subsea structure, if there's a certain point in time where you need to do a full removal of the structure, it provides all this benthic habitat, this fish, reptile feeding areas, mammal feeding stations, and so forth today. And it provides it tomorrow. It's going to provide it 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 500 years from now. It's going to provide it for multi-generations. And the removal of this removes that multi-generational value that would be projected into the future. So this red area really represents a loss of value. And it's a loss of value, not just to our generation, but a loss of value to future generations, our kids and our kids' kids. So that's one of the reasons why we think it's important to understand what are the ramifications in this option selection process and how do we look at that. The framework and implementing the framework, there's one of the things we found is even though it's quantitative and has data intensive analysis and quantification, it's primarily a desktop evaluation of existing studies. The operators typically collected many of the types of studies that you see listed on this slide. And these studies, we basically do a desktop study looking at these values and looking at what we have there to come up with the process to understand what are the impacts and the ramifications of different alternatives. In some cases, the ROV data, the remote operated vehicle data, there may be survey reports of the benthic and biological populations on the structure. That may need to be analyzed to look at what are the species. Are they commercial species? Are they recreational species? Are they species that are threatened and endangered? All that information helps provide value to the fact that these are very productive ecosystems. And it's one thing to say, hey, these are productive ecosystems. It's another thing to be able to show it and show that to the public and the regulators to understand what is actually happening around these facilities. In this process, we've worked closely with the operator through the process to help understand and help develop what are technically feasible options. And then understanding as well, to implement that option, you have to put together a campaign of, if you're going to recycle options, are you going to need what types of vessels? Where is the vessels going to take portions to be recycled? Or are you going to manage in place, potentially do partial removals where you place parts of it back into the ocean? So there's a lot of different information on those campaigns that we develop, as well as what is the cost of those options. When we look at the consideration of options, we typically look at a range that's bounded between, at a minimum, leaving it in place versus removing it in full. And between these, there can be a variety of partial removal options that we can look at. And Nick's going to talk a little bit about this in one of the case studies that he's going to present. When we look at the regulations under OSPAR and going back to a clean seabed, their base case is really, we want to start here at full removal. And they do allow you to do a derogation under certain circumstances where you can leave part of the structure in place up to the footings. And then when we look at a NEBA-based comparative assessment, we want to understand what are the benefits. And what this graphic shows is the benefits across the top of the green bars. And these are risks or potential impacts as you implement each option. So with this option, you can see the benefits and the marginal risks. And then as you go more and more from left to right, some of the risks increase, but by removing the structure, you remove some of the ecological and social value. So there's got to be a mechanism in the framework as to how do we look at all these different options and optimize what's the best option for the public. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Mark Raquel, and he's going to go through some of the economics of NEBA as it's applied to offshore decommissioning.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for that stimulating analysis. I'm going to talk about why a NEBA-CA should be preferred to a simple comparative assessment. And if you go to the next slide, I can start that. So in order to make the argument that a NEBA-CA is preferred to another framework, I'm going to go back in history in economic welfare theory. Why do we know if one alternative is better than another? And this, one would think in your mind, oh, that's a pretty simple question. I know, if I prefer creme brulee to carrot cake, I know that. Well, from a benefit cost or from a decision-making process, what we want to understand is how do we know one thing's better than another? Well, Wilfred Pareto came up with a criterion in 1896 that said, well, we know that whether a social change from an outcome or from an alternative makes the world better off, if indeed one person's made better off and no one else is made worse off. When you think about that criterion, you say, well, that's pretty stringent, because if I have 100 people and we all like this public park we're going to build, but somebody says, no, I don't like that idea, then it would fail the Pareto test. Well, it took 40 years later, and two professors came up with a more pragmatic criterion that seeks to identify potential Pareto improvements. So what they came up with, they said, well, an alternative is welfare improving if those who gain from the change could, in principle, fully compensate the losers, with at least one gainer still being better off. And that was what is called the Calder-Hicks criterion. And it's a test of whether total social benefits exceed total social cost. And it's the theoretical foundation of benefit cost analysis, or net present value analysis. And this equation on the right, basically I want to point out what it's implying. It's implying several things. First of all, that you need to measure benefits, over time. So if your project's 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, you need to at least try to measure what those flows of benefits and costs are going to be. The other thing, 1 plus R, over at 1 plus R, is essentially that's a discount rate. So what you want to do is incorporate the benefits flows over time in a discounted manner, because obviously a benefit today is worth more to us than, say, a benefit 100 years from now. So the benefit cost criterion requires the value and flow of ecosystem services over time, usually with and without a condition. The without condition is usually the baseline condition. And as Joe pointed out, we would use the baseline condition as the structure being in place, versus the comparative assessment starts out with a clean C4. Nevertheless, no matter what baseline you start out with, you should be able to end up with a similar understanding of what the values are for these different alternatives. The other thing that the benefit cost criterion calls for is that we use measures of willingness to pay or willingness to accept from society. So society's willingness to pay is ultimately what we're trying to measure, and that's why we developed all these economic models and methods to try to do that. The other key thing in using benefit cost criterion is you don't always have to convert everything into a monetary metric. And that's really key when we're talking about environmental services. Another key thing that benefit cost analysis uses the benefit cost criterion that you're probably familiar with is when people are trying to determine the medical efficacy of drugs. They use something what they usually call a non-monetary metric called quality adjusted life years. And there's a whole literature about that in the medical science community about how you do that and what you do. But the fundamental understanding is you're following this benefit cost criterion. I have a next slide, please. So another thing is Joe was referring to ecosystem services approach. The ecosystem services was kind of coined, after the Millennium Assessment in 2010. But this slide is just to point out that we've been trying to wrestle with this understanding. We understand that there's a connection between healthy natural systems and social and economic welfare. That's not new. As a matter of fact, that's a direct quote that came out from a conference of governors in the White House in Washington, D.C. in 1908. So this has been something that we understand, but we're trying to figure out, how to measure it. Next slide, please. So why is formal quantification of ecosystem services important? Well, as Joe kind of alluded to, it allows you to document the ecosystem cost benefit of an action, compares ecosystem benefit cost between actions, and then obviously selects and modifies those actions that could hopefully maximize ecosystem benefits, and quantified values before provides supporting information for decision makers and other stakeholders. And I think the thing here that I want to drive home is it's quantified values. There's usually obviously a model behind that uses data, and you can, a stakeholder or a decision maker can go back in and look at that analysis, look at the assumptions behind that analysis, and say, well, what happens if I change it? See what that does. In other words, it becomes very transparent. And what we have found by doing a bunch of these is it becomes an iterative process. You end up coming up and redesigning the kind of alternatives because you start to say, well, this one doesn't make any sense. And so you based on your new information of going through this process, you come up with, better options. Next slide, please. So a NEBA-CA tries to maximize the ecosystem service benefits to the public by managing site risks. And so again, just like you've seen this slide previously, we're trying to quantify all these different metrics. And we try to, as a comparative assessment tries to do, it tries to take into account all these factors that you see, on the left, and the right, and it uses, ecological habitat values, human uses of the sea, greenhouse gas emissions, health risks, navigation, trawling risks, technical removal risks, and costs. And the idea here is to put it in a formalized framework where we can try to quantify most, if not all, of these factors that are going to contribute to whether we can then come back and say, yeah, this alternative is preferred to this alternative. Next slide, please. So we use the benefit cost criterion to quantify values, and we use established economic methods to quantify those values. And we're trying to quantify those ecosystem service flows over time, and we're not always monetizing them. And so what I want to talk about now is some non-monetary metrics. You go to the next slide. So as Joe points out, everything in terms of human welfare, human value from an environmental issue, it all comes from the environment and how well and how good performed the environment is performing. And so what we typically do is we look at some economic models that do that. We use some things like benthic biomass, or it could be secondary fish production over time. And so what we tend to do here is we use something called a resource equivalency analysis, or its sister habitat equivalency analysis. And there again, you've seen this graphic. What we do is we estimate a baseline service condition. Usually with our NEBA, we're looking at what's the fish productivity say of what's going on at the jacket when it's fully functional. And then we look at alternatives and say, well, if I take 50% of the jacket away, what does that do to my fish productivity? And it depends, obviously, where you are and all that good stuff in the world, and what kind of ocean's going on and what kind of species you have. But more or less, we are finding that, yeah, that's a pretty good proxy for understanding what that change in fish productivity looks like over time. So that's just one example. Another example is greenhouse gas emissions. We don't have to value what the loss is or increase in value or decrease in value of greenhouse gas emissions. We can just quantify it in terms of ton equivalents over time and look at the difference between one alternative and another. Similarly with energy usage. So the point being, we can use the benefit cost criterion. We don't have to quantify everything or put everything in dollars or monetary value, and still get an understanding of what one alternative is doing versus another. The next slide, please. And then also, we're looking at quantifying changes in value over time, and we do money. We're economists. So one thing that's very critical for most stakeholders is the commercial fishing sector and the commercial processing sector. And we'll use certain economic methods, such as we'll look at market transactions, the loss and gain in commercial catch value. We'll look at how that could affect the number of vessels, and what that's going to do to their income, and then and we also look at what a standard benefit cost analysis would do, is look at the change in producer and consumer surplus value. But as a NEBA, we're trying to, again, it's a decision-making framework for stakeholders, and so things that are usually interested in, when I do benefit cost analysis, politicians say, well, that's great, but what's the change in the number of people that are going to work? How many jobs are you creating? How many jobs are you losing? And how does that work out into the regional economy? What's that going to mean to the tax base? And so we estimate that. We use an economic method called economic impact analysis. And what that does is we not only look at the fishing sector, but we look at the processing sector, because in a lot of these cases, you're going to see the processing sector at these small towns is a big employer. And so if that's impacted, that's going to have a substantial impact across the regional economy. Recreational fishing, some platforms like out in the North Sea, obviously there's not much recreational fishing, but some platforms like just off in the Santa Barbara Channel in California, there's a lot of recreational fishing that we've seen there. And there's not only recreational fishing, but there's tourism, whale watching. There's also charter boats for fishing. And so we need to understand two things. We need to understand what's the consumer surplus value, or what's the value of all those people to that. The ability to say, for fit recreational fishing, we know that there's increase in productivity around the jackets, so we can estimate the change in catch value and how that circulates up through the value to the individual fisher, as well as how that affects the entire recreational fishery. Similar with whale watching and those other things. We also look at the economic impact analysis, because again, people are going to say, those stakeholders are going to say, you're going to shut me down, or you're going to affect my business. So we look at that. And then finally, we look at rare and threatened and endangered species using what they call stated preference methods. And usually we're looking at studies that are, for example, in the North Sea, there were some studies that showed what the public's willingness to pay were for threatened and endangered species like Lophilia, which is a cold water coral. And the idea here is you're not only looking at people that use or potentially could use the resource, you're looking at the resources providing these kinds of economic benefits, i.e. preservation of rare and threatened endangered species that host a larger group of people. It could be the entire country, it could be the entire county or whatever. But the point is, you need to capture that value. And so those are the types of methods we use. Next slide, please. So I think really from the benefits of a NEBA-CA versus just a standard comparative assessment is we're able to specifically estimate benefits over time. We're taking into account the short-term and the long-term benefits. So the future is incorporated. As Joe points out, these structures can be hanging around for 3 to 5 to 800 years. And so it's important to understand that flow of services over time. And we also, I think the important thing is we're using standard economic models and methods to try to get an understanding of what the impacts are from each alternative to a variety of stakeholders, whether they're users of the resource or just have a stake in it, i.e. from I want a marine mammal preserve. And then we don't rank them. We basically try to use our methodologies to say, well, here's our model, here's our assumptions, here's the data that we've used, and here's the results. And so that provides transparency, I believe, and allows stakeholders to ultimately come up with the comparative assessment, which we think is best done with a NEBA-CA. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Mark, for helping to, I think, demystify the process and the framework of NEBA-CA. I think it's important that when we talk about providing a transparent basis for stakeholders, that we provide a level of transparency of how we conduct the analysis and what methodologies we use within the framework itself. So thanks for that. My name is Nicholas Nelson. I'm going to be working and talking through a NEBA-CA example case study that we worked on in the North Sea. So next slide, please. Okay, so hopefully we have a solid understanding now at this point in the webinar of both sort of the introduction of NEBA and its evolution into a NEBA-based comparative assessment, and some of the methodologies behind some of the metrics that we use to sort of build out the result framework for the NEBA-CA outputs. So I'm going to kind of walk through sort of cradle to grave how we work through a NEBA-CA in real life. So one of them we conducted in the North Sea. And so this sort of case study is about that. So the first step is analysis planning. So that's really when we sit down with the operator, we're determining, hey, what are your assets? What are their locations, their environmental condition? Is there any, social, PR, whatever, various, aspects of your asset and or assets. Then we kind of sit down and talk about, hey, what metrics might make the most sense to analyze for that given asset or set of assets, because as we've kind of been talking about, there's a lot of different ecosystem services that can be provided by an offshore piece of infrastructure, and it's impractical to try and go out and measure each and every ecosystem service. So sometimes it makes more sense to use a surrogate value, right, that might serve to display sort of the general ecosystem service value associated with one or more metrics. The second step is going into the options analysis and graphics. So that's really when we get into the meat and potatoes, the sort of segment that Mark was talking about, the actual analysis of, figuring out how many tons of fish biomass we would associate with the structure, not only today, but into the future. How many, jobs and how much, revenue would we expect from the commercial fishing industry, from the recreational fishing industry, doing our risk analyses and our emissions profiles, again, throughout the course of either the campaign or the lifetime of the structure, whichever makes sense for that metric. And then, the graphics portion is when we present sort of graphically our outputs for each of those metrics in a way that should help demystify what's going on in the decision-making process for not only the operator, but for regulators and for the general public. And then finally is a refinement stage via risk management decision-making. So that's kind of when we take a look at the data themselves for each of the metrics, and we filter them through a series of thresholds. So every operator, every regulator, and just the general public are going to have different risk appetites and thresholds for, whether it be, navigation risk or trawling risk or injury risk, emissions, so on and so forth. So we try to bound out the, the remaining options based on, which options are going to, minimize risks to an acceptable level, kind of harkening back to the ALARP, or as low as reasonably practicable levels of risk. So that's sort of the main purpose of those 3 steps. Next slide, please. So this diagram here is from this particular case study in the North Sea. And we conducted this study for not only the jacket, but for a number of other subsea assets. But for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to talk about the jacket here. So what you need to do in order to define, your series of options for your decommissioning is to determine, one, the asset, so the jacket. The second is to determine, are you going to decommission with or without an exclusion zone? This is a topic that Joe had mentioned earlier. The exclusion zone kind of serves to create a de facto marine protected area. And this serves to, protect not only the ecology that has, grown into abundance and is flourishing around the structure, but also to protect other users of the sea. So you need to determine, are you going to protect it in place, which means maintain the exclusion zone, or are you going to leave it in place, which means to maintain the structure, but to remove the exclusion zone? The third step is to kind of define your options range. So this goes, on one end from your in situ management, whether that's with or without an exclusion zone, down all the way at the end to full removal, which is fairly self-explanatory. So then you have, your intermediary options, your partial removals. So you could cut it at 15 meters, which is sort of that depth at which is generally safe for most ships in the North Sea to pass over safely. You could do a cut at 26 meters, which is common in the Gulf of Mexico, and is also safe for the largest ship ever built to cross over safely. There's another one, the IMO standard of 55 meters. And so that's sort of another internationally recognized potential cut value. And then you could also, in places like the North Sea, do a derogation depth, which is at the top of the footings. So for example, 100 meters. Now the fourth step is to figure out whether or not you're going to reef or recycle that cut portion, whether you 15, 26, 55, 100 meters, or do a full removal. What do you do with that cut portion? And so this operator wanted us to sort of define whether or not we were going to recycle that or reef it directly adjacent to the rest of the structure. So that kind of leads you into 4 major scenarios, one being to protect in place and then recycle whatever you cut. The second option set being to leave it in place. That means no exclusion zone, and to still recycle whatever you're cutting off. The third option or set of options being to protect it in place. Again, that means with the exclusion zone, and then reef whatever you maintain. And then the fourth option being to leave it in place, again without the exclusion zone, and reef it down directly next to the structure as well. All right, next slide, please. So, as Mark had kind of spoken to earlier in the presentation, it's an iterative process, and the purpose is to provide some level of transparency so that stakeholders and regulators and operators can see how changing an option might change maybe the implementation health and safety risks, or might change the emissions profile, or might change the projected biomass over the course of the lifetime of the structure. So you can kind of see those changes based on how you change your option. So for example, if you cut it off at 55 meters and remove that 55 meters to shore for recycling, that top 55 meters is now no longer being biologically productive. It's no longer serving as refuge. It's no longer providing hard substrate for benthos to colonize and then fish to use. So from there, you can kind of see on the ecological side, it becomes somewhat obvious. From the health and safety side, though, maybe removing the top 55 meters or 15 meters or whatever you decide to cut at is protective of vessels passing over it. So it reduces a certain level of liability. So it's all about, like Mark said, it's a cost benefit analysis, into the long term. So, when you're now conducting an analysis of the change in ecological value, we want to make sure that we're capturing that multi-generational value. So whether that's 300 years for that particular structure, 500 years, 1,000 years for that particular structure, however long we project it to stay viable and not collapse is when we start analyzing that length of time for biological levels. For metrics like implementation injury risk, let's say, you really only need to conduct that analysis out for, let's say, 6 months, however long that decommissioning campaign of activity is expected to occur. And go ahead, next slide. So this is a sort of full suite of potential options, and more could be added and or modified as necessary based on the field and the assets in question. But the idea is that we're trying to cover, as some of the earlier graphics had shown, environmental metrics, short and long-term risks, health and safety risks, economic value, social value, and of course, technical feasibility. So, we've got values like, total hard steel surface area. This is often used as a surrogate value for that habitat value, because, as Joe had mentioned, there's an abundance of soft bottom habitat, which means there's fairly little in the global scale of total hard surface area for benthos to colonize, fish to use as refuge, so on and so forth. We have on the other beneficial metrics, things like the coverage rate of colonization rate rather of benthos. You could talk about the commercial fisheries value, as Mark had talked about. And there's other active and passive value uses that you can calculate. And then on the detrimental side, we have things like, hey, what are the technical feasibility constraints within the option? Does it pose a buoyancy risk? Does it pose a risk that is unacceptable when it comes to the actual implementation of removing it? Is it too big or too heavy to cut in one section? Do you need to cut it in multiple segments? Then we start talking about other risks like the ecological risks associated with, maybe naturally occurring radioactive material or plastics. We discuss, what's the energy use requirements for, maybe shipping your material back to a disposal facility or versus just dropping it off right next to it to serve as a supplemental reef. All right, next slide. So this is an example of the output of the NEBA-CA for this particular case study in the North Sea. So as you can see, these benefits, which scale from 0 to +1, these are the generally, they emit a general positive attitude towards them. So things like habitats, biomass, whether that's benthic or fish biomass, commercial fisheries values. These are things that are generally positive. So we scale them from 0 to +1, with 0, kind of being, you're not creating any general value for that, and 1 being the maximum possible value. So each light blue bar on that left, that habitat volume in water, is proportional to the other habitat volume in water bars across options. And this is a really unique way for the NEBA-CA to present all the different metrics on one graphic so that you can see the relative change in value from one option to the next. Now, we do have data labels so that you can still see the absolute value, because it might scale to 1 because it might be the biggest value, but let's say out of a certain pipeline there wasn't very much biomass associated with it. Even though it might scale to 1, it's helpful to have that data call out to kind of figure out what's the context of that value. But you can see that there's a general decline in the benefits as you go from left to right. And by the same token, these detriments, which scale from 0 to -1, increase. So generally, these options are getting more effort intensive, more intrusive as you go from left to right. And so that only stands to reason that you're going to have more man hours, more cost, more emissions profiles, more risk in general. And so you can see an increase in risk and a decrease in benefits as you kind of go from left to right on this graphic, which hopefully helps to, help decision makers and regulators and the public understand the reasoning behind your final option. So this helps you come to an initial, sort of optimized option based on just the data itself. That one 8.4, I don't know if you all can see that, but that 8.4 risk level, and that's for cumulative collision risk over the lifetime of the structure. Expecting 8.4 collisions over, I think we calculated for 600 years, just seemed a little bit too risky. And so we moved over to the next best option, which manages that risk while still providing as much of a benefit as possible, or suite of benefits rather. So that was sort of our initial optimized option, but we still had to take it through the next kind of set, which is the risk management matrix and framework. So if you could go ahead and go to the next slide. So the risk threshold management process is really there to serve as a check and balance on the visual graphic analysis. So you take your hard numbers, those quantified values for emissions, for risk, for benthic biomass, fish biomass, commercial value, right? You find all of those values, you put them into a matrix, and you identify with those with your operator what the long-term risks are. So for this operator, it was collision risk was the most important thing to mitigate, and then the second and third being trawling risk, and then the fourth and fifth being option implementation risk. So that would be your injury and fatality potential risks. So once you kind of determine with the operator in tandem what's their threshold, you can sort of filter out any option that exceeds those threshold values for collision, right? Then for trawling, for snagging and potential loss of life. Then you can filter out the implementation risks, whether that's injury or fatality. So once you've managed your site risks to an acceptable level, or to ALARP levels, as many in industry know it, as low as reasonably practicable, then you can sort of identify and remove your short-term risks. So this is more of the implementation risks. This is more of the the risk associated with doing the actual lift, the removal to shore, the cutting it up and recycling it, or to just conducting a lift and setting it down next to the structure itself. These are campaign length risks. So now that you've managed all of those site risks, you can then move on to your emissions. Now, for every operator, it's going to be different. But as emissions profiles and ESG reporting becomes more important, this can influence, and they might have thresholds to say, hey, now that we've managed our risks, we really want to manage our emissions profile as a firm. So that our reporting, we meet certain goals, right? So whether or not there's a threshold for that is up to the operator, right? From there, you try to maximize within your remaining options whatever the best set of options are for your ecosystem service values. That's your commercial fishing value, your benthic biomass, your fish biomass, your coverage, your social values, and maybe education values and things to that extent. So now that you've managed your risks, the idea is to maximize your potential ecosystem service values, and then if and only if your your remaining options, you're left with multiple for a given asset, and there's really no metric that serves as a differentiator for a meaningful decision making, then and only then you can use cost as a differentiating tiebreaker. And the idea behind this is that you can refine and come up with a final optimized option from your NEBA-CA analysis, which, the goal of which, as we've all said, is to maximize site or maximize benefits while managing site risks. All right, next slide. So as we've kind of talked about and touched on a few times here, it's important that we're, considering our long-term multi-generational benefits, but also short and long-term risks. What are those risks of maybe plastics or from norm, short-term or long-term, whether you remove it or leave it or manage it in situ. The important part, though, is that we're analyzing all of these values over a length of time that makes sense for that particular metric. The second is that we really do not rely on rating or weighting these schemes, because any level of that starts to impede on the level of transparency that we're really aiming for all of the stakeholders. And that, again, leads itself to providing transparency. So the idea is that not only the operator can come to a decision, but that decision then is transparent and easily understood by the regulator, by the public, and anyone else who may be interested in how that decommissioning decision-making is working. Okay, next slide. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joe Nicolette here to sort of field any questions we might be getting in the chat.
Great, thanks, Nick. First of all, I want to appreciate everybody. I appreciate everybody attending the webinar, and just also want to make sure that there are in the chat box, there are some notes that will provide some information on access to a variety of the different materials that we talked about. And just wanted to say one thing about, stakeholder interaction through that whole process is important to get buy-off. But one of the reasons why we'd like to provide that quantification in that is that not all stakeholders are going to agree, because they have their different specific interests, but at least this way they can see the data and how it looks, and they may not like a decision that's arrived at, but there's a defined basis as to why that decision was made. But with that, again, I appreciate everybody taking the time to do this, and we'll respond to the questions that come up subsequent to this webinar, and we will get back to everybody. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Well, Mark, Joe, and Nicholas, I want to thank you for providing a wonderful presentation today for all attendees. I know that those who are joining us live are going to take away an immense amount of knowledge with them. Just a reminder that all resources that the presenters referenced during today's event will be emailed to attendees post-live event. Any questions we did not get to during the presentation today will be answered by the team as well. If you happen to be watching this on demand, please feel free to submit questions to any of the presenters, and they will get back to you as soon as they can as well. Thank you again to the team at Montrose for, as always, providing us with an immense amount of information that is truly applicable across many sustainability and environmental fields. At this point, I'm going to conclude today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.